Hey, what's up guys? This is Anthony from AnthonysCustoms, and for this review, I'm very happy to show you the amazing Yamaguchi Revoltech Wolverine, or just the Revoltech Wolverine, let's just call it that. We all know this line has been plagued with issues from its inception. Some people love it, some people hate it. It's a very stylized line, and so, there's a lot of subjective contention for these figures. Now, I'm going to avoid as much subjective stuff as I possibly can. I might sprinkle it in, but I'll let you guys know when I'm saying something subjective. Otherwise, I'm going to be looking at this thing as objectively as possible so that you guys can get the information you need to decide whether or not you want to buy it. So let's go ahead and take it off the stand and take a closer look. This guy stands just about, let's call it just over 6 inches to the top of his ears, which obviously his head's just a tiny bit shorter, but just about 6 inches. He's a little bit shorter, but not by a whole lot. Unfortunately, I don't have Deadpool with me to show you, and I never purchased any of the other ones, so I can't show you a comparison, but the height measurement should be sufficient. Deadpool's in Texas, unfortunately, so I can't show you that. So this guy, I skipped out on everything since Deadpool because I'm just not a huge fan of the stylings, but I was going to give him a chance for Wolverine, so that's why we have this here. I was hoping they would do some things with the shoulder pads to kind of hide this double joint that they like to use for the shoulders, and then overall it just had a pretty cool look to it, so I figured what the heck, we'll give him a chance. And so now we get to do the review. So there is a lot of subjective stuff I could say. I'm going to try to avoid it and then maybe just kind of sprinkle it in because I know you guys like that kind of stuff. Before we get into the figure any more specifically though, let's talk accessories. We have a total of 3 different heads. We have the one neutral head, the one head where he's kind of just grimacing, and then one where he's yelling. It's worth pointing out that the paint job on the heads is not particularly clean. It's acceptable, but it's not great. Another thing worth noting is for the grimacing head, the teeth are not sculpted. It's pretty much just a giant chunk of white, so it leaves a little bit to be desired. Whether or not the sculpt is any good, I do definitely have some objective issues with it, but for the most part, it's going to come down to whatever you like, so I'll leave that for you guys to decide. You can see that for yourself. We have a few different hands. We have the 2 fist hands and the 2 open hands, and those can both either receive the extended claws or the non-extended claws. I know a lot of people take issue with the claws for Wolverine being longer than his forearms, and I understand that. I totally agree. Subjectively, I really do like this extended stylized claws, so I'm going to say it's okay, but again, that's totally up for you guys to decide on your own. They are painted very nicely. It's a great metallic silver, and they have the right amount of flare at the end. I think it's a really nice look for the claws, so I'm happy about those. We do have some other hands which are very disappointing, however. We have 2 hands that appear to be for holding guns, which I just don't get. He doesn't come with anything, and I guess you could give him guns from Deadpool or something, but why? I don't know. Maybe someone can tell me why that is, but it's still a very strange accessory to not come with guns, but have gun-holding hands. And then we have another hand. One more hand, which I presume was for holding a cigar, but he does not come with one. So we have 3 hands that are meant for holding specific items, which are not included. It's a very strange situation, and obviously a detractor for the figure. He doesn't come with really anything. And then we do have this one other accessory, which is just like a clear slash thing, which is meant to be used with Deadpool, but it's just like it's a very okay slash accessory, I guess. It's meant to peg into Deadpool's back, and it just looks weird. Like I don't get it. There's like no blood or anything. It's just a weird reverse curve slash, which doesn't make any sense at all, but it's there. And then lastly, we have a display stand, so that's fine. That's nice to get a display stand, so that's a good thing. So yeah, that's it for the accessories. It's a very light figure in terms of accessories, which is not great because it does come in at a pretty hefty price point, so I don't get it. It's very, very strange in that regard. So moving on to the figure, does it warrant the price point for other reasons? Maybe, maybe not. Let's see. How's the paint job? Honestly, compared to other import figures, it's not up to par. It's not terrible. It's not super sloppy or anything, but it's not particularly good. If you look at the line work for the blue and yellow, it's not terrible, but again, it's not particularly good. There's a lot of yellow peeking through around the bottom here for this upper part. It's just the belt looks fairly sloppy, fairly translucent, kind of reminiscent of a Marvel Legends figure. Like I said, for the head, the paint job's not great. Where the gloves meet the forearms, it's a little bloody in terms. What I mean by that is the paint's bleeding through. It doesn't look particularly good, or more accurately, the plastic is bleeding through the paint. It definitely could be a higher level of finish. It's not terrible, and if you don't look at it too close, you probably won't notice most of these things, but these are things to notice. One other issue I have with this guy is the sculpt. Some of the sculpt is fine, and I don't mind that it's stylized, but things like having these chunks of inner thigh sticking out, it's just weird. And like this one is fairly flush to the leg, so that's fine, but this one doesn't ever really want to go. So you just kind of have a chunk of meat hanging out there, and it's just kind of odd. So mostly this guy doesn't have that issue too much. Like some of the figures have had that, but others not so much. The rest is all about articulation, so we're going to talk about that in a minute. The last thing I want to point out is the skin tone on him is pretty weird. It's fairly orange. It's a little odd. The sculpt for the arms, I'm not going to worry about that too much, other than his biceps are very tiny, but I can even get away with that because it's just styling, so I'm not too worried about the sculpt. I think it looks pretty good, but the tone is very strange. It looks a little bit better for me under these lights, but I'm guessing for you guys it looks pretty much how it looks to the naked eye normally, and that's fairly orange, so be aware of that. Okay, so as far as the articulation goes, this thing is very much in line with what Revoltech likes to do. They like to try to give you the ability to put your figures in super crazy poses, highly dynamic poses, at the sacrifice of looking at least somewhat human, and at the sacrifice of just normal posing. So this is one of those subjective things. If you want to get it in really dynamic poses, for the most part, that's going to be attainable, and if you want to put it in somewhat more standard poses, you're going to have to accept the sacrifice of the sculpt. So we'll get to the chest in a second, but that's a great example of that. So one of the things I really like about Revoltech, and this is a good example of that, is the way they have the heads articulate with this extra layer in here. It's very nice because you can have the head look up and look down without really any gapping, and so you can move it from side to side, and it works very nicely. And in terms of what kind of joint that is, it's just a ball hinge, really. It's a standard ball hinge inside the neck, but they have this extra floating piece in here which hides it, so that's very, very good. For the neck, I'm not positive. It feels like it's just a ball peg, but I can't really get in there to move it too much or to pull it out or anything, but be aware that the neck does move, and I can't say for sure what it is, but it feels like a ball peg. Now we have this issue with the shoulders. I know that they have this piece right here, this entire piece it's essentially just a swivel, but it moves around, and that is so that you could put his shoulders back or forward for various posing. I get why it's there. My issue is with the execution. It's not seamless at all. It could have been, I think, handled much better, and the problem really is that you end up with these big gaps right down the chest, and the suit does kind of hide it with the blue stripe, but not so much, because you have a blue stripe and then a yellow and then more blue, and it's a little weird. And then for the sculpt, we have these muscles right here, which go underneath the bicep and down along the lats, which essentially line up with the ribs, but you can't really line them up properly. It's very weird. There's no way to get it to line up the way you need it to line up. The yellow's never in place properly. Down here it is, but up here it's just iffy, and it's just not really handled that well, and essentially it doesn't give you that much range, because, yeah, you can lean them forward some, but they don't go back too far. It just feels to me like it's not a good trade-off. Now, again, that's kind of subjective, but objectively it does look pretty ugly no matter what you do, and you don't get that much extra range out of it. I mean, you can bring the arms forward a little bit more. So, I don't know if it's worth it or not. I guess you're going to have to decide for yourself. On the back, it doesn't look too bad. It's a lot more clean looking. On the front, they put jaggy lines everywhere, so it's a little iffy. Now, one of the things that's generally problematic for Revoltech is this double jointed shoulder socket that they like to use, which I totally get why. It does allow for you to bring the arm across the front of the chest more, across the back more, but it does pose problems when you're trying to be in a more neutral pose. So if you just want to raise the arm, you either have a huge gap or you have to push it back like that, and then it looks like he's just really shrugging his shoulders. So that is a problem. I was hoping the shoulder pads would hide that for this figure, but the way they articulated the shoulder pads, they rotate pretty much around the shoulder itself over here rather than covering the gap. So you don't really get that much extra help. So it's a little bit better than something, say, like Deadpool, or even like the Figma Solid Snake. It's just the shoulder pads don't do as much coverage as they probably should have. One other issue is the shoulders are exceedingly weak on this figure. His arms just flop. And since you have these double ball hinges, you often have to do a lot of rotating and manipulating of the shoulder joint in order for it to work properly. And for me, I don't know if you can see right there, it keeps splitting, and I've had both of the arms just pop off completely, actually separating the two pieces of the joint, and they're very floppy and flimsy joints, so be extra careful with that. Yes, you can put them in slightly more dynamic poses, like you can bring the arms forward like this, but I don't know if that's, like, obviously that's not a good pose, but I don't know if that's worth it. You're going to have to decide for yourself. For me, and I would argue even to some extent it's objective, that it's not worth it, but it's up to you. As you can see, it doesn't look terrible in more neutral poses because the shoulder pads do hide it to some extent, so that's okay. For the elbows, there's a couple of things going on here. We have a ball peg down here and then your standard ball hinge, so you can raise the arm like a standard Revoltech figure and you get really good, almost 180 degree bend, so that's awesome. But you do have this huge cavity, so that's one of those trade-offs I was talking about, so that's up to you if you like that. I personally don't. But the cool thing about the way they did this one, if you don't want the 180 degree bend, you can actually seat the arm. It's only about a 90 degree bend, but then you don't have any huge gaps. So I do really appreciate that. I like that a whole bunch. I like that they added that, so that's pretty good. For the wrists, it's just your standard ball hinge. However, they chose to, let me see if I can show you without breaking it, they chose to use about the tiniest ball hinge possible, which really doesn't make sense because the wrist is fairly large, and having the tiny one in there doesn't help anything. If you have a bigger ball hinge, you get better range out of it, so I'm not sure why they did that. Claws can fall off, obviously, because they're interchangeable. For the abdominal section, it's not unlike most Revoltechs that I've seen. We have one ball hinge, essentially, that pegs all the way down into the crotch. In this case, it pegs in back here. And then when it goes all the way through, kind of sits inside of the abdominal section, and then pegs into the chest. So you really only have one hinge to crunch on, but it does give you a pretty good range going forward. I don't mind it. No real gapping or anything in the back, so that's okay. And you can make him stand upright. I know some people were concerned about that. It can happen. You don't really get too much movement down here other than a swivel, which is the thing that bothers me. They could easily add a second joint, so you get a really good hinge up here and a hinge down here rather than just one in the middle. This is fine, though. It's just a little iffy when you're trying to rotate things because they peg in at angles. This one's at like a 45-degree angle back here, so rotating the abdominal section, it can get tricky. The belt is completely floating, so it does hide a lot of the gapping pretty well. When you look back here, you do see some weird junk in the trunk type situation and some weird gapping, but it's not too bad. He's actually one of the better examples of how their abdominal section can work well. It's not too bad, so I'm okay with that. Now for the hips, I do take some issue because we just have a ball peg holding this piece on, which does allow it to move a little bit. Like this upper hip piece, you get, I don't know, about 45 degrees worth of bend out of that, and then you can rotate it forward some. But here's the thing that's really weird. Look at how angled this swivel is. And then we have this big hamstring piece back here to kind of hide the whole thing, but the swivel is totally vertical, well, almost totally vertical. So you can't really rotate the thigh properly. So you can raise the leg this way and then raise it more if you want to, but then it totally shifts the whole leg. So you have to bring it forward and then rotate it out to the side, which there's no reason for that. You don't need to do that. The swivel right here should not be at such a severe angle. It doesn't accomplish anything. In fact, it impedes the articulation in many cases. You end up having to fight with the figure to get it posed how you want. So I definitely am not a fan of that. That's an objective thing. It can be handled such that you can pose the figure, but it's not a good design. And then again, like I said, we have more of these chunks of meat just hanging out for no reason. For the knees, they don't look bad when the knee is normally up. That's fine. It's a very basic joint. It's a swivel, like old school, super old school swivel. So why is there this giant gap right here? I don't know. They could have easily just not had that. There's no need for it. It's not the worst thing in the world. It kind of looks like armor, I guess, so that's something you could live with, but you only get 90-degree bend. I'm not sure why they bothered doing that. It does look a little bit better in some cases, but in others, it's not great. So it's not, it's kind of up to you if you like that or not. It's just kind of an odd choice. We do have a ball peg where the boot meets the shin. So if you need to rotate that a little bit, you can. You can move it around to give them bow legs if you want. I'm not really sure how useful that is, but it's in there. It doesn't hurt anything, so that's fine. For the ankles, we have our standard ball hinge with an offset, so it kind of connects with the ball peg down here, much like the Storm figures do. So you can see you can offset the foot. So if you need to lean it all the way forward, you can tuck it in. You do get a bit of gapping, but you get really good range out of it, so that's pretty good. Or if you want to go back, you don't do it that way. You leave it forward and then go back. So it's kind of strange in that you have to offset it with this big gap back here in order to use it either way, other than just standing still. So if you like that, fine. If you don't, it doesn't really hurt anything. You do get a decent ankle rocker out of it, so that's really good. Ankle rockers are always nice. And then we have our toe hinge, which is actually pretty good. So is this guy better than Deadpool objectively? I think in some ways, yes. The design does help. The shoulder pads do hide it at least a little bit. Oh, I want to point out, the shoulder pads, at least on this one, it really doesn't want to move, and it has just such a tiny little peg. It's very hard for it to be useful. This one's a little bit easier, but it still doesn't cover the shoulder gap as much as I'd like. So, yeah, I mean, there are definitely some improvements on this thing. It's not, as far as I can tell, it's a step in the right direction, but again, it's really going to come down to what you're looking for in a figure. His ugliness is hidden a lot easier, but it is still there, and there is still a lot of that weird non-functionality in the joints that I think could have easily been avoided if they'd stopped trying to make crazy joints and just use normal joints. We've seen many times a butterfly joint that's highly effective. Variable Action Heroes has done a very good butterfly joint. Even Storm has done it on a few of their figures. I don't know why we have these weird separations that don't actually accomplish all that much. But again, it really comes down to what you like. So if you do like it, then, go ahead and pick it up. It does come in at a very high price point, relatively speaking. Limited accessories, questionable paint quality, and then, the rest of it. It's really going to come down to what you think. Personally, I don't think it's worth the price point, but I don't hate it as much as some other figures I've purchased. So, hate that I spent the money, I guess I should say. It's actually enjoyable enough to handle, so I'll leave it there, guys. Thanks for watching. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. I have new videos up every single day. We talk about action figures, movies, TV shows, video games, and all kinds of other fun stuff, so make sure you come back for that. Give the video a thumbs up if you liked it, and in the meantime, keep collecting.